Well, hello, Remnant America. This is The Remnant, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. And I am not Jonah Goldberg. I am Chris Stirewalt. I am in his stead. I am but a humble apparition, a cipher in the place of the great man. But I have something great to talk about, I think. So picture this: a consequential vice presidential nomination choice, wrestling within the innards of one of the great parties. And the choice may be influenced by one of the individuals having perhaps too soft, too cozy a view of Moscow, and perhaps too much of a fondness for Russia. No, not J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. No. This is the story of a fulcrum point, a turning point in American political history. And I am very happy to share with you this wonderful book, The World That Wasn't, which is about FDR's second vice president, former agriculture secretary, and the commerce secretary, and a fascinating American figure. I want you all to meet Benn Steil. He is a senior fellow and the director of international economics at the Council of Foreign Relations. He is the author of two impressively researched, impressively dense works of economic history. One about the Marshall Plan, which is really good, and one, The Battle of Bretton Woods, John Maynard Keynes, Harry Dexter White, and the Making of a New World Order. For the wonk community, this is serious and good stuff. But the story of Henry Wallace came over into my world, came over into the world of politics. And Mr. Steil, welcome and thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, who was Henry Wallace?
So Wallace played a major role in all four of FDR's administrations. He was FDR's agriculture secretary in his first two terms. So this is from 1933 to 1940. In 1940, he was very controversially put on the ticket. FDR did not tap him as his first or second choice, but when he did tap him, he was quite insistent that he would not run unless the convention endorsed his choice. And this really split the party quite dramatically.
What was so controversial about him?
He was seen as being too left-wing. At that time, there weren't the great concerns about his Soviet connections, which started to materialize during FDR's third term when he was vice president. But he was a controversial agriculture secretary. He was seen as being a mystic and somewhat dangerous in his religious views, which veered into astrology, theosophy, and all sorts of unconventional beliefs. And it turns out that as I was researching the book, I discovered that his theosophical beliefs had far more of an impact on geopolitics in FDR's first term than anybody had ever realized. So the concerns were very valid.
So Henry Wallace, if the shorthand on Henry Wallace from the American right is he was a communist sympathizing, useful idiot who was being played by, if not a willing participant of helping the Soviets. The story that
I would characterize him as a Soviet sympathizer rather than a communist sympathizer.
Yes. The story that you might hear from the progressive community would be the story of, and that's why I love your title, The World That Wasn't, because he saw a world that wasn't, right? The spiritual world that he imagined that they were living in, and that Xanadu would be achieved here on Earth, and all of that stuff, as well as the fictive world that was created for him by the Soviets, but also the vision of a progressive America that he ardently believed in. And, it's funny, as I was reading the book, I heard more than a little bit of Great Society. There were I heard echoes of it in the histories and conversations that I've had about the Great Society and the dreams of the 1960s, that he was, in the eyes of many progressives, maybe just ahead of his time.
And he was in certain areas. I think he was quite late to the day on civil rights. In fact, when we get to 1948 and he decides to run for president against Truman as an independent progressive, he's criticized by many civil rights leaders for having done nothing during his time in office as Agriculture Secretary or Commerce Secretary to integrate those departments compared to others in the administration, like, for example, Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau. Nonetheless, he was very bold on civil rights at key points in the 1944 convention when he lost his vice presidential spot to Truman. He spoke out at the convention very clearly, very boldly against the poll tax, which of course was a major barrier to African Americans voting in the South. So he made no effort to pander to the South, even though he needed their support in order to stay on the ticket. And in 1948, he undertook a week-long tour of the Deep South, in which he condemned all forms of racism and segregation. And quite frankly, he was lucky to have survived it. There were many attacks on him personally, on his vehicle, and they were very dangerous. So he was bold in that regard, no doubt.
And on things like universal health care, on things like a close relationship between labor unions and the government, and other priorities. A lot of Walter Reuther vibes coming through when I was reading what he had to say in the immediate post-war period and all of that energy. But you mentioned the 1944 convention speech. And I got to say, as a political writer, you, an economist, you very well captured this moment, the drama, the dynamism inside that convention hall. And he gives this speech where I believe he uses the term liberal. Mm-hmm. I think you said 11 times or 12 times.
It was a brilliant speech.
And so he gives this speech. And one of the things that listeners to this podcast are familiar with, something that we wrestle with, is Roosevelt, progressivism, and liberalism. When does the word liberal, which used to mean something different, right? Liberal used to mean something different, and then it went through a redefinition, and it seems like maybe that speech and Wallace's understanding of that word and use of that word was a significant waypoint on that evolution.
Yeah, in general, he used the term liberal. He clearly had an incentive to replace the term liberal with the term progressive when he ran at the head of a new progressive party in 1948. But in general, he used the term liberal when he was part of the FDR administration because it was associated with the president. And he wanted to make it clear that he was the president's rightful heir, at the very least on domestic issues.
And if what we mean by the rebranding that Roosevelt undertook from progressive to liberal was to make it less scary, more in line with traditional American values. This isn't a radical departure. This is the same liberal kind of democracy, liberalism that they had been accustomed to. One of the things I really like about your book is I can never quite tell what you think of Henry Wallace.
Oh, that's good to hear.
And you did it really very impressive, because I would finish a chapter and I would say, okay, this guy's got it in for. He's decided that this guy is bad news. And then you read the next chapter and you say, okay, well, maybe he likes him. Maybe he's for him. What do you think of Henry Wallace?
I think he's a fascinating human being. And as you know, my last book was an historical narrative on the Marshall Plan. And I do think that General Marshall, broadly perceived, was a great man. And I would hate to write a biography of him. He's not that interesting to me because he doesn't have or he doesn't emanate the sort of mortal flaws that I and 99.9% of the human race have. Wallace is an utterly fascinating human being with superior capabilities in a number of areas. He was an absolutely pioneering agricultural geneticist. And in a way, he had the sort of same intellectual boldness that Einstein had in a very narrow area. Okay, I'm not comparing his intellect to Einstein, but Einstein had this ability to step back and say, well, maybe we've been perceiving problems like gravity completely incorrectly for centuries, going back to at least Newton. And that's the equivalent of what Wallace did in Iowa. In Iowa, you had these corn experts who did these well-attended shows where people came to hear their views on what the superior strains were. And Wallace, in his 20s, just thought this was absolute bunkum. And he didn't know at the time how to define what the best corn was, but he set out to figure it out empirically. And he conducted very rigorous experiments. And through those experiments, he produced an enormously successful commercial enterprise, initially to hybridize corn, but then became heavily involved in the sort of natural genetic engineering of agricultural crops of all sorts, which was eventually, decades later, sold for $9.5 billion. And he revolutionized agriculture in a number of countries around the world. In particular, he's still well known today in Mexico and India, of all places, for his contributions to agricultural productivity. But as a political figure, I think he was fatally flawed. And as you know, I reference Oliver Stone's quote unquote, yes, 2012 documentary, The Untold History of the United States, in which he argues that Wallace was unrightfully stripped of his vice presidential spot in 1944. And had he continued on, of course, he would have become president when FDR died in April of 45, and that there would have been no Cold War. I think that this particular argument is not only very wrong, but quite dangerous, because it gives this perception that all you need to get peace in the world is a leader who is dedicated to the concept.
Yes, if they really wanted it. If they really wanted it, then they could have it. The story of Wallace. So stop me and correct me wherever my recounting is wrong. Wallace wanted to go to Russia.
Absolutely.
Wanted to go to the Soviet Union.
And he wanted to meet Stalin.
He's vice president. FDR says, you're crazy. With the concerns that people already have about you being flaky and lefty, I can't have you going to Moscow. So
this is March of 44.
They concoct a trip in which he's going to go chum up with Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese Republicans and do that. But they tack on a trip through Siberia at the beginning, that this is deemed it'll be okay because it's not going to Moscow, it'll be lower profile. And in reading your recounting, and you obviously, the amount of research that you put into this book is stunning, because we get to hear the firsthand accounts of the people, the aides and others who, and including the Soviets. We get to read both both sides, but the observers' perceptions of what's going on. And they put on a whole Potemkin
continent for it. Remarkable.
Yeah, they for 1,000 miles across Siberia, they had party officials pretending to be working in agriculture. They did all of this stuff to put it on, and nobody else was fooled, but Wallace was fooled. So tell me the story of how a person who is Einsteinian in his grasp of genetics and seed, and obviously a very smart person in some ways, was so easily duped.
I speculate, and of course it's no more than speculation because I'm certainly not a medical expert, but I say early on in the book that he has all the classic characteristics that we associate today with Asperger's syndrome, which had only been quote unquote discovered by an Austrian Dr. Hans Asperger in 1944, interestingly. So he had these characteristics. He had a superior intellect. He was brilliant at discerning hidden patterns among physical phenomena, but he could not read people at all. He couldn't detect duplicity, whether it was from his NKVD hosts in Siberia or from FDR himself. He couldn't read people's agendas. He couldn't bear any form of small talk whatsoever. There were basically only two topics that were of interest to him for discussion. One was agriculture, and the second was spirituality. And if you decided to gab with him about the weather, he would quite literally be looking for an escape route. And if he happened to be sitting down, he would often literally fall asleep. And it wasn't just boredom, it was literally his body shutting down. He could not deal with social interactions of any sort. So, what's quite remarkable about Wallace, among many other things, is that, he came so close to becoming president of the United States and really putting post-war history on a completely different trajectory. Yet he was the most unlikely of politicians imaginable. He could never have been elected to office in his own right. And of course, he did try once in 1948 when he ran for president.
And he got the ag job on his family had a magazine or a newspaper.
Yeah, Wallace's Farmer, which was very influential.
So they had a successful ag business, and they had an influential periodical in the business. And that set him up as sort of a boy wonder kind of guy. And that is what made him attractive to the Democratic machine to put him on the ticket with FDR in the first place, right?
FDR, during the 33 campaign, sent Henry Morgenthau, who was his most trusted advisor, off to the Farm Belt to get political views about what FDR should do should he be elected, because of course, the Farm Belt was in utter economic devastation, and Democrats were really worried about a revolution. And one of the people that Morgenthau spoke to was Henry Wallace. Morgenthau was certainly more orthodox and conventional in his thinking than Wallace. He thought Wallace's policies were a little too radical, but he admired Wallace's knowledge and forthright ways, and he introduced Wallace to FDR. And FDR ultimately decided that this was the right man to take charge of agriculture policy. As you said, the fact that he had been editor of this influential publication, Wallace's Farmer, was important. Remember, at the turn of the 20th century, about 40% of the U.S. population lived and worked on farms. So this was a big deal. And of course, he had already begun to develop a reputation as an agricultural geneticist. So in this regard, he was a logical choice for the post.
And he was a former Republican, and he was from Iowa, which would be politically helpful, and all of that stuff. And a good-looking guy. He was cut a fine figure. He and Roosevelt shared an interest in the occult or the supernatural, or whatever. And by the way, there are about 5 great movies in your book. There are 5 or 6 wonderful movies that you could make in your book. Tell us about the master and the code and the mission to Central Asia to establish a new country.
Yeah, so this particular episode that you referred to, I had initially thought would be a small section of a chapter on Wallace's time as Agriculture Secretary. Instead, it became on its own the longest chapter of the book. Could have been easily several chapters, over 20,000 words. So what I discovered in the archives in Russia was a remarkable trove of documents that told a very different story than had previously been told about this allegedly seed foraging expedition to Central Asia that Wallace undertook as Agriculture Secretary. He sent 2 agricultural experts from his department off to Central Asia to look for drought-resistant seeds to help, repair the Dust Bowl in the Midwest. But he made a very controversial appointment to lead this expedition. It was a white Russian artist and mystic named Nicholas Roerich. Wallace had first discovered Roerich's museum when Roerich was off in Central Asia in 1927. And fast forward to 1933, Wallace is, by this time, effectively part of a religious cult run by Roerich and his wife.
And you tell to interrupt briefly, you tell the story of when he found the museum, and he walks in and he's standing. And was he Agriculture Secretary by that time?
No, not at all. He was a private citizen.
And he walks into the museum, the Roerich Museum in New York, and he's standing in front of one of these paintings.
Tibetan prayer mat.
And he's struck dumb. Yeah. And he stands there unmoved until eventually the people come and inquire of him, "Are you okay, sir? Is everything all right?" And they must have known at that moment that they had a live one on the line.
Did.
That they really had somebody they were going to be able to do some good with.
Wallace assured them that he was okay and that he was just experiencing quote unquote vibrations. But as you can imagine, fast forward 6 years and Wallace is now in FDR's cabinet. He becomes utterly invaluable to these people who are effectively part of this, as I say, mystical cult, because they are now in almost direct contact with the president. As you learn over the course of reading the chapter, eventually the Roerichs bypass Wallace entirely and make a connection to the president himself. It's a rather remarkable story. But what Wallace does is he appoints Roerich to lead this expedition, even though Roerich has no expertise in seeds, knowing full well that Roerich's own aim was not to find seeds, but was to recreate the legendary Shambhala in Central Asia. Effectively, what Roerich wanted to do was to create a new theocratic state in Central Asia that would arrogate territory from Russia, Siberia, Mongolia, China, and potentially as far afield as Tibet. And Wallace really went out of his way to aid the creation of this state. And as you know, this area of the world was extremely dangerous at the time. It was contested among a number of world powers, in particular Russia, China, Japan, and Roerich becomes the target of great suspicion over the course of 1934, 1935, of Soviet intelligence and Japanese intelligence. And in mid-1934, a series of articles are written about the expedition that are clearly based partially on fact and partially based on Soviet disinformation that panic Wallace. And suddenly what he does is completely disown the expedition, claims that lies, absolutely lies, claims that Roerich was acting completely on his own initiative. Wallace knew nothing about it. He just wanted seeds. And Wallace becomes utterly vindictive, gets the IRS after Roerich. They slap him with a massive tax bill. He's never able to return to the United States, and the Soviet Union won't let him back in the country.
How sincere, and this is a question you wrestle with throughout the book, the sincerity of Franklin Roosevelt. And there is a almost Trumpian capacity that you read, not just in your book, but in others with Roosevelt, to tell people what they want to hear. Whatever setting he's in, he's going to tell people what they want to hear. And he is very artful in his creation. The story, by the way, when people read your book, the story of the competing letters of endorsement for the 1944 vice presidency, and they're all kind of true. Everything he says is kind of possibly true, but it's the word that kept coming to mind was to elide, to withhold relevant facts to allow others to reach the incorrect conclusion. How interested in this stuff was FDR and in the occult and in this stuff, and how much of it was him just humoring what he thought were influential people?
Right. This is a great question. As you pointed to the 44 election as well, when FDR endorsed 4 separate candidates for vice president in 4 separate ways. We are not lacking in documentary evidence about what FDR did and what the FDR said at different points in time. But it is almost always impossible to know what FDR actually believed. So this much I can say about FDR with regard to the whole so-called guru episode. FDR was very interested in the occult. As you know, the pyramid with the Masonic eye on the $1 bill, that was the result of a collaboration between 2 Masons, Wallace and FDR. FDR inherited this interest from his mother. And as you know, the financier who backs Roerich and eventually takes over the whole museum and helps Wallace keep Roerich out of the country, uses his connection to FDR's mother to get an introduction to FDR. So Louis Horch is his name. And Horch introduces many of these mystical interests of the Roerichs to FDR. Now, FDR, unlike Wallace, clearly didn't draw any geopolitical implications of Roerich's thinking. He was just interested in it in the abstract. My reading was that he continued to meet Horch because he wanted to keep tabs on Wallace. You know, what was Wallace up to, and make sure that things didn't go too far in this area, because FDR was smart enough to know that Roerich was not an expert on seeds, and there had to have been other reasons why Wallace put this man at the head of an expedition. So there's no evidence that FDR shared Roerich or Wallace's geopolitical agenda in the region, and
keeping his options open.
Always keeping his options open. And once these critical articles started coming out, he made very, very clear to Horch that he did not want Roerich involved in any sort of politics whatsoever.
So there's a motif that develops about Wallace, whose code name in the cult was Galahad.
Galahad, yeah.
Where he imagined himself this sort of knight errant and this sort of naive, this country boy, this simple man who was bewildered by the scheming and machinations of these, venal city people and doing whatever. I think it seems like he saw himself that way. But repeatedly, he also was dishonest and vindictive, and he was those same things. So we have a guy who you can believe a story about Wallace that he was on the spectrum, as they would say, and that he was unsophisticated in many ways and was taken in. But then, and starting with the story of the Seed Expedition, when the jig is up, he lies, he throws him under the bus, he sicks the IRS on him, and he acts politically that same way.
And he lies to the public when his letters come.
And lies to the public. And I notice over and over again that his vision of himself as this noble man of the soil, when he figures out that it's in his advantage to lie, cheat, or steal, he's willing to do it repeatedly.
Now, Wallace is a man who thinks very highly of himself. And his views on many subjects change radically over the course of his political career. But at no point does he ever lose confidence in himself as a sort of agent of the Almighty. It's really quite remarkable. He views himself as being above mere political mortals.
The people that hold some of my deepest sympathy in the book are the U.S. Marines, I think, and others who are forced to play volleyball with Wallace as he travels around the globe, and he needs to get some exercise and compels people in the freezing weather or pouring rain to play volleyball at great length with him. And I just thought, imagine how you would feel if you were some embassy guard somewhere and they said, okay, the vice president or whoever's coming in, we're going to have to go outside and play volleyball. Say, oh, can't I be excused? Can't I be excused?
Absolutely. And he takes that grand tour of Latin America in spring of 1943. He just wanders away from his security detail early in the morning and goes and talks to people in the markets, and word of where the vice president is actually getting back to Berlin. I mean, this is serious. And as you know, during his time in Siberia, for example, he would wander away from his NKVD hosts, at one point running up this grassy knoll in a restricted area. He literally pushes aside the slats in a fence and runs up the hill faster than the NKVD agents who are trying to control him can run. He's just completely oblivious.
The point by the time he is wrapping up his term as vice president, the Soviets didn't quite believe that he was really on their side. It was almost seems like it was too good to be true.
As you know, they stole his diary in Siberia to see what his views really were. And I think they were genuinely surprised to see that the diary confirmed that he had great admiration for their, as he put it, economic democracy.
But by the time he is in the Commerce Department, so he gets FDR throws him under the bus, blames it on other people. He gets unhorsed at the 1944 convention in favor of Harry Truman. And then, amazingly, agrees to stay on as Commerce Secretary.
Immediately. As FDR, remember, he doesn't want him outside the tent pissing in. Wallace is now a dangerous man because he's now the leader of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And FDR cannot afford to have him as an enemy. So he immediately sends him a telegram saying, come to the White House, let's talk about your future.
And they're going to give him the Commerce Department. But in order to get Commerce to overcome the conservative Democrats' concerns in the Senate, they stripped the Department of Commerce of the very powers that Wallace wanted, which were the broad regulatory and lending powers that the Commerce Department had taken during the war.
Right, under Jesse Jones, who was Wallace's mortal enemy. So Jesse Jones also controlled the RFC, Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was a massive government piggy bank. And Wallace desperately wanted to control the RFC.
And we should not allow this podcast to elapse without explaining one of the reasons why, you said piggy bank, one of the reasons why Wallace carried such ignominy in the minds of many in agricultural America and many Americans was his experiment with hogs during the opening phase of the New Deal and the drowning and slaughter of hogs to try to drive up hog prices.
6 million pigs. He ordered the premature slaughter of 6 million pigs. Of course, he eased the blow by paying Midwestern farmers enormous sums for this. I added up the total value of the subsidies that came from Washington under Wallace during the first two terms and put them in $2,024, and it comes to an astounding $1.2 trillion. It is an amazing amount of money, and that bought him, if not goodwill, in the Farm Belt, cooperation, because some of the things that he was demanding, not just the slaughter of 6 million pigs, but, for example, the ripping up of millions of acres of planted cotton and other commodities. Farmers thought this was absolutely insane. This was all done to boost prices. But if you're just boosting prices by destroying the supply, you're not improving the welfare of these people. So this was just really wacky economic.
And the beginning of decades of paying farmers not to farm, right? Which is this weird regressive thing where wealthy landowners can make a living, can make money by not growing anything on the land.
And in fact, as you know, from reading that chapter, Wallace made himself extremely unpopular. And the liberal wing of the agriculture department by directing these subsidies to wealthy landowners in the Midwest, whereas the millions of tenant farmers, sharecroppers, these were overwhelmingly the descendants of African American slaves, did disastrously badly out of this. Why did Wallace do it? Well, there are many reasons we can speculate. Wallace, for example, liked to refer to Jefferson's idea that, the farm-owning families were the backbone of America, but it was farm-owning, not farm-working. But he was savvy enough to understand that Roosevelt depended on the Southern farm barons in order to keep the Democratic coalition together. And it was made clear to him that if he enraged these people, he was going to lose his position. So he made a political calculation. But FDR thought in 1940 that putting him on the ticket was going to help him in the Farm Belt, and it did not. Wendell Willkie, FDR's Republican opponent, only won 10 states, but 7 of them were in the Farm Belt, including Iowa. So, Wallace didn't do FDR any good in his own home state. And he did disastrously badly in the Farm Belt in 1948 when he ran for president. He barely got 1% of the vote in Iowa.
And the programs didn't work. Was another problem. the programs didn't work, and he seemed unfazed. And I guess maybe this is the motif of scientific experimentation. So Wallace we're talking here about more than $1 trillion in transfer payments, trying to reinvent agriculture, trying to remake the way that America works, eats, lives, and does all of this stuff. And he did. Well, expand on that. How did he do that?
Well, I did a blog post last week talking about the farm legacy of Henry Wallace, who was supposedly a champion of the common man. And I show that today, fast forward to today, and agricultural subsidies in the United States are massively regressive. They're overwhelmingly directed at large commercial farming enterprises. So, this had been initially marketed as a way to save the farmers, the backbone of American democracy in the 1930s. And look how it's evolved. And this is a direct legacy of Henry Wallace.
Well, don't you know we need sugar subsidies for national security?
Of course.
If we were to not subsidize sugar, who knows where we'd be getting sugar from? It's very, very dangerous.
And Lord knows America needs sugar.
So Wallace, by the time he becomes Commerce Secretary, the Soviets have identified him as on their team.
They're following him. Gromyko in Washington, for example, is cabling back to Moscow. Basically, you wouldn't believe this, but I discovered that Wallace said we were right to invade Finland. He's passing this stuff back to Moscow.
And he gathers around himself. So in the universe, and I think for us today, it's hard to think about it in these terms. But for Americans of Wallace's vintage, there were lots of people who, before the terror famines, before the purges, before whatever else, there were a lot of liberal or progressive or left-minded Americans who were deeply invested in the idea that a workers' paradise could be built, that maybe there's some problems. Maybe Lenin did too much. Maybe Stalin is kind of a brute, but there's a good idea at the core of this, and we want to see it work. And in places like New York, particularly, but in among intellectual elites, there were real debates about who are the Trotskyites and who are not, and all of that stuff in the 20s and 30s in the United States. But Wallace doesn't come out of that, right? He's not that kind of sympathizer. He seems to come to it from a agricultural, religious, he's dropping into this stream from a different direction than those people. Is that right?
That's fair. His views evolve pretty dramatically over time. In the late 1920s, he's certainly anti-communist. He considers communism a vile, godless ideology. But he very much supports the heart of Stalin's economic, shall we call them, reforms, and that is agricultural collectivization, which, as we know, wound up killing millions of people in the Soviet Union. And Wallace was not unaware that there was famine and chaos in the agricultural sector in the Soviet Union. But he was fundamentally convinced that this was an experiment being run by technocrats, by experts. And Wallace, although he was certainly a small d Democrat, didn't like the messiness of having to appeal to voters. And so he was fascinated with the fact that the Soviets could experiment with large-scale agricultural reforms without having to deal with the messiness of democracy. And that's basically how Wallace ran the agriculture department in the U.S. He pretended to listen to farmers, but what he was essentially doing was simply bribing the richest of them, the large landowners, to support his initiatives because he had enormous money behind him. But in 1933, when he was part of the Roerich cult, Wallace argued virulently to FDR against U.S. recognition of the Soviet Union. He said it would undermine religion in the United States, even to have economic relations with these people. Why? Because his guru, Nicholas Roerich, was in one of his anti-Bolshevik phases and literally ordered Wallace to oppose a recognition of the Soviet Union. After he breaks with the Roerich cult, things change quite dramatically, and Wallace starts making speeches as vice president praising Soviet quote-unquote economic democracy. And at that point, you see his political views changing quite dramatically.
When we get to 1945, 1946, there are real live Soviet agents in his orbit. There are real live people who are working him, operating him, trying to manipulate the output and decisions of the Commerce Department. It's funny, when you grow up with the understanding about the problems of McCarthyism, et cetera, and the second Red Scare and all of that stuff, I forget. There were actually some Soviet agents. There were actually some people doing the wet work.
You know the expression, even paranoids have enemies, right? And so by no stretch of the imagination am I going to defend McCarthy. I mean, he was a vicious liar. But Hoover, in many cases, hardly all of them, was behind the eight ball. But I could not have written my material on Wallace's time at Commerce without the FBI transcripts.
So the FBI is tracking. FBI agents are tracking Soviet agents who are trying to manipulate and control the U.S. Secretary of Commerce.
So to be very specific, some Soviet agents, they are literal agents. They're reporting to Moscow. Wallace's top economic advisor at Commerce was a communist, an devout communist named Harry Magdoff, who was doing just remarkable things like leaking Wallace's private cabinet papers on atomic issues to Moscow. Others in Commerce who were advising Wallace were what you would consider Soviet assets. So they weren't taking direct orders from Moscow, but were willingly assisting Moscow's agenda and deliberately manipulating Wallace. So none of the previous Wallace biographies made any use of the FBI transcripts, but they're literally necessary because Wallace would do and say many things during his time as Commerce Secretary. For example, that the auto manufacturers can afford an immediate 25% increase in wages without raising prices, and you wouldn't know where this came from. But if you would go to the FBI archives, you could find that since all of the people under Wallace have their phones tapped, they're being followed and so on, you have these transcripts of their discussions about what they're doing and how they're manipulating the Commerce Secretary. And they are all actively trying to undermine Truman.
Now, at this point, Wallace is viewed with great suspicion inside his own administration.
Truman doesn't want him there, but he, like FDR, thinks he has to keep Wallace on as Commerce Secretary in order to secure his left flank.
But people are aware of him as a problem, right? They're aware of him as a problem, that the Soviet sympathy, the flaky ideas, all of this stuff. And so there's a lot of trying to placate him. There's a lot of trying to keep him bouncing forward. But one of my favorite moments in the book, in that great confirmation hearing, the outgoing Secretary of Commerce, Jesse Jones, takes the witness table in the Senate, and he published a letter that Franklin Roosevelt had sent him a kind of pitiful missive from Roosevelt saying to him, I need you to leave quietly at Commerce because I have to have someplace to stick this dope. And it's the job that he'll take. And will you please just go away and I'll give you whatever ambassadorship you want.
He offered him Fed chairmanship, anything. And Jesse said, no, not interested.
And he said, not only did he say no, but he published Roosevelt's letter to him and his response. And then he goes in front of I forget which committee in the Senate. And in this great sort of inherit the wind kind of scene, delights the audience and the newspaper, the gallery packed with newspaper reporters with his just vicious attack on Henry Wallace.
The deference that the senators pay to Jesse Jones is really quite remarkable. When he walks into the room fashionably late, he just takes over the place. You know, the photographers just gather around and he's greeted by the senators. Wallace has very little support on this committee. And as you know, he barely squeaks through. At one point, I won't walk through the complications of the confirmation process because it really was very intricate. But he's saved by the tie vote of who else? Harry Truman. Harry Truman could have ended Wallace's career, but he cast a tie vote that kept Wallace's nomination alive. And eventually he gets the Commerce post, but stripped down.
Did Wallace ever know that he was being operated? Was he ever aware?
Oh, he came to be aware. Yes.
Okay. So how did he handle that?
Disingenuously. So he initially, for example, praised Harry Magdoff to the hilt. For his services, he wrote him glowing reference letters after he left Commerce. But when it came out that Magdoff was indeed a Soviet asset, he started making statements to the effect that, of course, Harry Magdoff was a bad man. But he didn't have any influence over me, et cetera, et cetera. So Wallace was constantly doing that over the course of his career.
If he had stayed on the ticket in 1944, let's say that vote had gone differently, and you make a pretty convincing case that it wasn't going to go differently because the elders and party bosses had made a decision. But if it had gone differently, and he had become president, what does that version of American history look like?
Right. I've been asked this question in the context of the American political structure. Well, with all our checks and balances, would he really have done that much damage? And my answer is yes. And these would have been, in Wallace's case, primarily sins of omission rather than commission. That is, the things that Wallace wanted to do, for example. He staunchly opposed the Marshall Plan, for example, after Stalin came out against it. He was in favor of it until Stalin came out against it, and then he was staunchly against it. He wanted to replace the Marshall Plan with a $50 billion program financed entirely by the United States, but the money funneled through the UN, so the UN would have control of the money. Most of this $50 billion would have gone to Moscow for reconstruction. So we would have been literally giving the Soviets in 2024 dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars after the war of U.S. taxpayer money. And we wouldn't have controlled the use of any of it. That would have been left to the UN. That's obviously not going to pass through Congress. It's not going to happen. But if you consider how instrumental Harry Truman was in deterring Stalin, for example, from taking over northern Iran, taking over territories in eastern Turkey, dominating the Turkish Straits, intervening in the Greek Civil War. It's clear if you read, for example, Molotov, Stalin's foreign minister, in retirement, he made clear that, if we had pressed any further, there would have been an Anglo-American aggression against us and we would have lost. Truman sends a military flotilla to the region. Okay, Wallace is not going to do any of this stuff. Okay, so if President Wallace does nothing, would there still have been a Cold War? Sure, but it would have started in 1948 when he would have lost the election. And Wallace acknowledged that he would have lost the election. And he also acknowledged in retirement that he was completely wrong about Stalin. But by that time, the Soviets would have controlled eastern Turkey, northern Iran, Hokkaido, the entire Korean peninsula. Likely the communists would have come to power in Greece. And of course, ultimately, he would have controlled the United Germany. And so the Cold War would have started late, as I say, in 1948, but we would have been fighting it at an enormous disadvantage.
Was Wallace rueful when he realized all of this, when it became clear to him after 1948? Was he rueful? Was he bitter?
So, yeah, he was bitter is the exact right word. This is the way I interpret things. Wallace, after losing in 48, he tries to reinvent himself as a mediator between Moscow and Washington. The Truman administration won't have anything to do with him. Stalin doesn't want to have anything to do with him. He realizes, that the peace man is useless. Nobody will talk to him anymore. And so by the time we get into late 1949, Wallace is an angry man because he feels he's been betrayed by communists, by American communists and Soviet communists. He's looking for a way out, and he gets it in June of 1950 with the advent of the Korean War, which he blames entirely on Moscow. And he just, everything's changed now. Stalin ordered this. Stalin could stop this. This is outrageous. When my government and the United Nations both say we need to go to war, I back my government and the United Nations. Of course, the United Nations backed the United States because the Soviets had walked out of the Security Council. So this was clearly a pretext. This is a bitter man looking for a pretext to break with the American communists and the Soviet communists. And he resigns his position within the Progressive Party, which, as you know from reading the book, had been completely taken over by the CPUSA. And then he starts doing interviews, and he writes a piece called Where I Was Wrong in the New York Times, saying that he had misunderstood Stalin, and that Stalin wasn't, in fact, a partner for peace. He acknowledged that he had been completely wrong about major events of the early Cold War. For example, the Czech communist coup in February of 48, which Wallace had amazingly blamed on the U.S. ambassador and quote-unquote rightist forces in Czechoslovakia, meaning the small d Democrat. But remarkably, even though he acknowledged that he was wrong about all these things, he still insisted that if Roosevelt had survived, that somehow the Cold War would have been stopped in its tracks, which really didn't make much logical sense.
His resentment for Harry Truman.
He loathed Harry Truman, called him repeatedly that son of a bitch.
And the thing, the Harry Truman that comes through in your book and a lot of books about Truman that I have read is that an unlikely figure in many ways and likely the right man for a very, very difficult moment. That instead of the abstruse cigarette holder plumes of obfuscation of FDR, and also instead of the hardline militarism of some on the right, that Truman's plain-spoken, straightforward. Never had Harry Truman stood for 20 minutes in front of a Tibetan prayer rug and felt any vibrations. And that very straightforward, very American way of being was just the right thing for that moment.
I agree. And he also had some skills that FDR didn't have. FDR was not a particularly able delegator. Truman, he made some bad appointments over his time, but overall, he was a remarkable judge of talent. The people he empowered, in particular, George Marshall. But I would also single out, Dean Acheson, people like George Kennan, Will Clayton, people who were, in some respects, like conscientious objectors during much of the FDR administration. These were people who were brought to the fore by Truman. And when we talk about the greatest generation, on the political side, these were really Harry Truman's people, not FDR's.
And we were extraordinarily fortunate that we had Truman and Eisenhower back to back as the world was being remade. We had these stable, steady, calm and ready kind of folks who were in these jobs.
And as you know, Wallace came out and endorsed Eisenhower in 1956.
And yet, just as we close this up, why? Why would he do that? Was he trying to reinvent himself so completely? What's the thinking there?
Over the course of the 50s, he's progressively disengaging from politics, which was never really his thing. He got dragged into it. He went back to his farm in Westchester County and started experiments again in chicken breeding, looking to breed chickens that would eat less and lay more. And his engagements with politics were quite limited. He came to see Eisenhower as a figure who was somehow dedicated to his idea of peace. But, I think it was, once again, Wallace looking to disassociate himself from people and organizations that had let him down. The Democrats had let him down. The progressives had let him down. So he goes back essentially to the Republicans. He never re-registered with any political party. So this is a man who joined 3 political parties and quit 3 political parties. But he not only publicly endorsed Eisenhower in 1956, but we don't actually know how he voted in 1960. The New York Times had 2 articles, one saying he voted for Kennedy, one saying he voted for Nixon. But he did meet Nixon at least once. They had a 45-minute conversation on geopolitics. And he appeared to have a genuinely warm relationship with Nixon. And Wallace was very critical of Kennedy's farm policy. Not foreign, but farm policy during the 1960 campaign. But if you read his interviews during the late 50s and certainly into the 60s, he's completely detached from politics. He's really not interested in it anymore. He regrets the fact, I think, that he ever got involved in it. And it pains him when people ask him about episodes in his career, particularly running for president as a progressive, which is really the low point in his career.
I can't let you go without exploring the parallel that I couldn't get out of my head when I was reading your book, which is it's not on the American left now, but it's on the American right, that there is an enchantment, an ensorcelment about Russia, right? There is this belief that, well, the Ukraine invasion is really NATO's fault. Well, really, it's the United States has put Putin in such a dire position. And the parallelism is so powerful to me to where we were with the Soviets 70 years ago, 80 years ago, where there were people this time on the other side of the political spectrum, but basically saying the same thing, which is we need to understand Russia's difficult position, and they're going to have to do some things that we don't think are so great, but really they should be our partners in peace. Were you thinking about that stuff while you were doing this book?
Yeah, sure I was, because the parallels are pretty compelling. Wallace said that ultimately the Cold War was the fault of the United States and Great Britain, because of their imperialist behavior, and he went back to 1970, and he said, "Look, we, the Americans and the British, tried to strangle the Bolsheviks in their in their cribs, right? And so we bore responsibility for the deterioration in relations, and it was our responsibility." To repair that damage. It's not for the Soviets, it's for us. Fast forward to today, and you've got certainly elements within the Republican Party who would justify the Ukraine invasion, for example, by referring to the expansion of NATO. And I say that as somebody who thought the expansion of NATO was not a well thought out idea. But the notion that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was justified by NATO expansion, I think, is quite outlandish. But there are elements in the Republican Party who do take that position. And then you have Trump and others in the Republican Party who admire Putin as, in their eyes, a competent dictator who can do what's necessary. He doesn't have to deal with the messy barriers that democracy puts up in front of you all the time. And Wallace had that sort of same fascination. He, as going back to our discussion about agricultural collectivization, he really admired the fact that in his eyes, these great Soviet experiments were being led by experts who weren't being interfered with by ignorant people. They could do what was necessary. And yeah, it's fascinating that we see elements of that thinking on the right today. But those parallels really are there.
The yearning for whether it's China or Russia, the envy of authoritarianism, because it is very appealing to people who think they know the right answer. They can say, if I could just have the power, if we just had the power to make people do the right things, we could finally defeat human nature. We could finally overcome all of these problems, and we could move it. It's just going to be a little bumpy. Once we get past the liquidating of the kulaks, then we're going to be on into the sunny uplands, and everything is going to work out.
You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, right?
That's right. Well, Benn Steil, I can't thank you enough for the time, and I really can't thank you enough for the book. As a writer of political histories, I say I want more economic historians to start writing political histories, because there are many good things that you did, but maybe my favorite was good inflation numbers, the actual value of dollars, reliably and correctly updated. I really appreciate that, but it's a great book, and I really thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me on the show. It's been great.
Well, there you have it, Remnantitos. Given a temporary command of this podcast, I took you deep into the nether regions of political history of mid-century and 1940s America, and I regret nothing. Do you hear me? I regret absolutely nothing. I will tell you there is a very special edition of The Remnant coming up with Brother Jonah having returned. I'm not at liberty to tell you too much about it, except that it will be awesome, different, and cool. So thanks for being with us. And I guess all I can say is we'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is my podcast.